What about the Joe of the gaps? That's a popular argument that skeptics like to use on Christians. We'll talk more about this in a moment. But first, let's talk about the God of the gaps. Here's what that is. You're talking to a friend about all the stuff that science doesn't explain, and every time you bring up something, your friend says, "Yes, but that's just a God of the gaps argument." You know what that is, don't you? That's when someone says you're just punting to God to explain what hasn't yet been explained by science. You say, God is the cause of the beginning of the universe. And they say, see, God of the gaps. You say, God explains the remarkable fine-tuning of the universe. And they say, there you go again, God of the gaps. No matter what you say, the beginning of life, the Cambrian explosion, irreducible complexity of the cell, the information found in DNA, human consciousness, free will, the existence of objective moral values and duties, they always say, God of the gaps, God of the gaps, God of the gaps. But listen very closely to them, because they usually reply with the Joe of the gaps argument. What's that? Well, given enough time, some future Joe or Jane scientist will find a suitable, natural explanation for all these mysteries. What they're really saying is that science will one day explain all that's explainable. Sounds familiar? That's because it is. The Joe of the gaps argument is an example of scientism. Scientism is the belief or philosophy that science is the only source of true knowledge. But scientism is a philosophy, not a finding of science. When people use the Joe of the gaps argument, they're really taking a philosophical position that was debunked years ago. And when people use the Joe of the gaps argument, they've positioned their defense beyond any possible falsification. No matter what you say, they can always reply, Joe of the gaps, and you can never prove them wrong. Where does the Joe in the Joe of the gaps argument exist? The Joe in the Joe of the gaps argument is imaginary. He exists only in the minds of believers in scientism. Maybe a better approach is to examine the evidence at hand for God's existence and follow wherever it leads, even if that's away from scientism.